Hey folks, this is Drew with the Building Great Experiences podcast. With me, I have one of my longtime friends, Joel Tracey. He's done a lot of really cool things in his career. I'll let him introduce himself here in a second. But one of the things that I think is most notable, Joel created this really great collective called Culture Initiative. And they hosted many events around town that were focused on bringing people together. And it was around art and culture and music. Today, we're going to be talking about something really exciting, brand equity, and how that drives brands forward, how you can build brand equity, and how it affects customer experience. So with that, Joel, thanks for being on the show, man.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Drew. This is truly a privilege. Again, my name is Joel Tracey. I am with JTCM Studio, a local independent creative marketing studio here in Charlotte. We specialize in brand strategy and design, marketing, and content creation. I've worn, a lot of hats through the years. I've been a DJ, cultural curator, a designer, community organizer, and most recently a photographer and videographer.
First, we should start with what is brand equity, defining that for our audience and listeners, and then also talking a little bit about why it's important, why it matters, why people should care.
Sure. Yeah. So brand equity is both the perceived value that a customer could have for a brand, as well as the sum of all of the creative assets. Brand equity as it relates to businesses is the thing that like builds recognition. Its colors, its typography, its logos and patterns, even into like the photo and video principles that you might see online and websites. By having a strong visual foundation, it helps kind of deliver a conscious reputation with the customers that speaks to quality and whether it's a product or a service, but then also like helps deliver on loyalty and just an excitement around the brand.
Yeah. We when we had coffee a couple weeks ago, a few things that stood out to me because we went deep on this topic, and things that kind of like resonated with me was this idea that a lot of brands today are just they're playing the quantity game, right? They're focusing a lot of time and resources on how do we game the algorithm, how do we create a bunch of content, how do we just get it out there. I think a lot of brands that have diluted their brand, they've diluted their equity because they're playing that quantity game. And you said something really, I think that really stuck with me, which was how the quality of your content, the quality of the storytelling, the quality of video and your messages really matters, and how it all comes together to tell this bigger story. Maybe talk a little bit about that, like how quality is important with brand equity.
Yeah, I think it really starts with a business, regardless of how big or small, is to really have a sense of what their positioning is. Who are they speaking to? What is the product that they're serving? What is their North Star? Like what brings it all together? And, once a brand truly knows like where they're going and what they're doing, why they're doing it, it's easier to kind of start building an equity that supports that. Right. And, what you're seeing more and more now is businesses, especially with the tougher economic crunch that everybody's feeling is to kind of find a cheat code to whether using, AI platforms or bringing things in house or, relying on software that's kind of doing the work for them. Ultimately they're cheating themselves, right? Because if you're not really considering that brand equity, that those colors and, specific brand fonts and logos and just aesthetic, ultimately brands start losing the foundation. They start losing their way. So if, in this case of having somebody that's unskilled to like be the voice of the brand, they're not considering the positioning. They're not considering who they're speaking to. They're not considering like which direction the brand's going to. And then, all the assets that are being posted are just all over the place to the point where like brands lose their foundation, the important parts of like what builds that reputation visually for a company. So, the easiest way to fix that is to have a very robust brand equity that's solid, that really speaks to everything that you are. And it could be as simple as just a few colors, right? Like, a lot of people are using Canva right now, but like, if you have a color palette to work with, if you have a couple fonts and a hierarchy and typography to work with, you can make those tools work. I mean, they are just tools. So, just rely on the foundation of what you are rather than allow it to be broken, ignoring something as important as brand equity.
Yeah. So with the whole topic of brand equity, I think people probably listening are like, how does this connect to experiences? And I'm going to attempt to connect the dots. When you think about, I've talked about this before, this idea of these experience altitudes. There's product, which is like the digital physical thing that you're selling to your customer. What's the experience that they're having with that? Service is across all those different physical, digital touch points you have with the customer. And then there's the next altitude, which is brand. And above that, ecosystem. But brand is like the cumulative sum, as you mentioned, of all those different things, right? It's what there's a classic quote. It's marketing is what you say you are, brand is what you actually are, what people think of you. And if you are providing a great experience from a service standpoint, you're providing great products that also have a great experience, and your brand positioning, your brand presentation matches up to that, where you're delivering the promises that you're making in your marketing messages and the way that it all is cohesive, you're delivering on those promises you're making through the products, through the services. That's where I think the magic of brand equity and customer experience comes together. I think another thing to think about with brand equity is it's like you can individually place bricks and build this wall or build this house, right? And every time that you like place a brick by, having that consistency, having that, voice and tone that differentiates you from others, having that look and feel and aesthetic that's uniquely your brand, and that, connects back to your mission, your purpose, your vision. You're placing a brick with your customer, right? Like they start to view you in this way. But every time you do a quick hit, like I'm just going to make some quick stuff or use like an AI generated whatever, it's like removing those bricks, right? You're taking them away, and now people start to think less of your brand, and it deteriorates over time. And so, I think it's really important that when you're creating these products, these services, when you're creating your marketing messages, when you're thinking about how to position yourself, it's not just don't think of it in isolation from one another, right? Don't think of, oh, I'm just going to make this quick social media post and like check a box, because that you're taking a brick off the pile, right? You're removing that brick, and now it's going to be that much harder to rebuild it later on, because people in their minds are like, oh, well, they're like that cheap, crappy, quick hit social media stuff that looks like everybody else. It's a sea of sameness, right? Which honestly, because of AI, there's so much noise and sameness now that it's really hard to separate yourself. And so I think don't get caught in that trap, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Analogy that I use with a lot of my clients is really the North Star in defining your purpose as a business. And I think that the moment that you take your eye off a compass or understand like where you're heading, you start wandering, right? And then like the next thing you know, like you have no idea where you're at, right? You're just in the middle of the wilderness. Like you have no bearing on like what true north is. So there's no getting out of the mess that you're in. And a lot of times it's just, consider your North Star, and every decision that you make, down to something as simple as a social post, or, if you're in food services, like if it's a limited offering or whatever, like if you're serving up tacos as a business and all of a sudden you have meatloaf Wednesdays, like you've lost your way. Unless you're putting meatloaf in a taco, like you're kind of going against what your true purpose is, right? And you see a lot of businesses do it, right? Especially with programming. If the seats are not full, if business is slumping, you'll try anything to like get people in the door. If you have a very concrete purpose that your business kind of leans to, and then in the scarce times, you just start doing whatever and checking boxes, you start losing your way a little bit, when you could do programming that really engages with your customer and then pushes your brand forward. all the way to social posts, like you mentioned. Like if you start using colors that aren't in line with your equity, again, if people are just scrolling through their feed, they're not going to stop because it doesn't even look like your brand, right? Or
Uh,
it's going to look like, a point of desperation, or like, where is this quality brand that I love and I'm so loyal to? They're starting to lose their way. And, customers subconsciously really think that, especially with the amount of content that they're scrolling through on any given day.
yeah. I think one of the other things you and I've talked about this before is this idea that people with branding sometimes it's like cheap, like they kind of take the obvious route, right? Like a company who's based in Charlotte, maybe they're serving a specific type of food, and they just sort of like throw purple and teal on it and use the Queen City, kind of like the Queen, and then they call it a day, right? And having it like, oh, look, we're a Charlotte born and bred brand, but it's like all the like on the nose obvious stuff versus saying like one of the examples I love is Old Mecklenburg Brewery. Uh, when they first released their Cat and Jack like ale or Pilsner, I don't remember which one it is. Um, you have to actually know you have to know what that is. You have to
Yeah.
know the history of Charlotte to have an understanding of like what is the historical significance, which I think then just connects their brand to like, we deeply know this area, we deeply know the region, we know the history. And, I think that's another part of the quality that drives that brand equity is not everybody's going to get it, but those that do are really going to say, wow, they're invested in this community. They're invested
Yeah.
in their customers. And it's not just a transactional, like, throw some purple on it and call it a day kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think, to take it further, if the brand is really going to continue to drive depth into the narrative of their product or services, is to back that up with good, positive storytelling, right? Like, Captain Jack, probably one of their, better beers, that I've had, but what does it mean? Do the customers like really understand who that is, what they're giving, a tribute to, or is this something where it's just the name of a beer, right? And so, especially with the city being such a transient, up and coming city with a lot of population just kind of increase year over year, a lot of people are not aware of the history of Charlotte, Mecklenburg, the Mecklenburg Address or whatever. So I think it's important for brands that if they are going to embrace a narrative and a depth of a city that might not be widely known, is to continue telling stories, right? Like, don't tell it once and then just put it on the shelf. Like really make that part of the brand and speak to it constantly and truly pay tribute to that thing. And I think Old Mecklenburg is a really great example of somebody that embraced the depth and the history of the city rather than just throwing a crown on it and like, or a hornet and like checking it and calling it a day, right? Like, there is some history here. So like lean into it, but then don't forget to tell the stories and keep telling the stories.
Yeah. Yeah. The keep telling the stories thing is really, I think, important. It's easy to forget, like I was listening to this podcast a few weeks ago, and there's a story of an ad agency that was doing work for like, I think Henry Ford or something like that. This is like way back. And the CEO or the partner every day was kind of going back and forth and kept seeing this ad like over and over and over again. And, a month or so later, it was like, guys, like, why are we still running this ad? They're like, we haven't even gone live with it yet, man. Right. And there was this realization of like, oh man, like you're probably going to get sick of your own story, your own message. Right. But doesn't mean your customers are going to be sick of it. It doesn't mean they've actually seen it or heard it yet. Right. You kind of have to sometimes tell the story over and over and over and over again for them to actually like remember it and be able to make that mental connection of, oh, your brand has historical connections. Your brand is making this impact in the community. Your brand is having this, effect, and it means something, before it really like sticks. So
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely. I think it's important, especially using social more now than ever before. It's important that we don't toss away good storytelling for song and dance, right? Like it's a brand's opportunity to really share with their customers like what they're about, what they do, the thought process that goes into their products and services, and rather than having like one story that just gets told over and over, to have a group of stories that you can kind of like rotate. And so you're not like in cycle or kind of on a repeat, continuing to tell the same story, but like keep talking, keep sharing stories. Don't keep them so dry that it's the same one over and over again. Because again, like in brand equity is an effort to show the depth of your brand and the value of your brand, and that it's so much more than just a logo on the front of the building, right? Or just a flagship product or service. Like there's so much more to these businesses that are, regardless of the industry, so the only way to really demonstrate that with a customer is ongoing storytelling.
I One other thing, and then we'll transition to who's doing this well. There's this former client of mine. They're in commercial real estate, and obviously B2B is a bit different than B2C. But one of the things they talked about was this idea of decades, not deals, meaning every interaction they have with their customers, they viewed it in light of a decade, right? Like this is us depositing or laying a brick for our brand with this customer, the client, for the next decade or multiple decades, rather than it being just, oh, this is an opportunity for us to make a dollar or do this deal or do a transaction. Said differently, it's think about the long-term customer lifetime value over the individual transaction, right? And I think that a lot of companies, especially right now, are overly fixated on transactions, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do we get our sales numbers up this quarter? How do we increase our, revenue? How do we increase our conversion? And don't get me wrong, like that's part of business. However, you have to also think about the long-term impact of if you're making short-term decisions around we're going to make sales, we're going to drive these transactions, you more than likely are affecting your long-term brand equity and relationship with that customer.
Yeah. Yeah. And you see it, especially again, like tough economic times, you're trying to get through the week and sometimes get through the day. And it's important to look at the long term and not to think so short-sighted where I think, regardless of the industry, you're spinning your wheels so much and working twice as hard if you're just thinking about how do I increase sales on a Tuesday or this Tuesday or the following Tuesday? And rather than like, how do we come up with a long-term solution that kind of like increases week over week rather than I just need to make a sale next, on one specific day.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about OMB. I'd love to hear your thoughts on like other brands that are doing this well, that are investing in brand equity, focusing on the long term.
One of my favorite local brands that has been absolutely crushing it is Night Swim Coffee, a collaboration between Not Just Coffee and Undercurrent Coffee. They've started roasting beans as well as opening up coffee shops, and it's absolutely made a huge imprint on Charlotte, made a huge imprint on me. I think every meeting that I've set in the last 6 months has been Night Swim. It's great atmosphere. The coffee is like second to none. The service is just always positive. And the brand that Matt Stevens designed out is just a home run. It's quality product. It's not overstated. You don't walk in and feel that you're in like a fast food kind of like with logos everywhere. It's just enough to just really show the depth and the thoughts throughout the equity. And then coupled with really incredible coffee and great service and a beautiful atmosphere, they really get it. And they're just absolute home run and probably one of the better brand experiences, customer experiences that I've seen in Charlotte over the last several years.
Yeah. I think, I'm going to point it to industry and then I'll like double click, but I think the sports industry is really good at brand equity because you think about a lot of these sports teams that have been around for 50, 60, 70, 100 years. it's a multi-generational brand, right? And that's true with colleges, right? Like, for example, locally here in North Carolina, we have UNC and Duke, right? NC State, Wake Forest. You have these big universities that for generations, people are like loyal, tried and true fans, and they really invest in those long-term legacy relationships, right? And so I think sports is a really big one that you can look at for inspiration on who's doing brand equity well. Arguably, some of those sports teams could improve their fan experience. You know, I don't know that the fan experience is always great, but from a brand equity perspective, they do it really well. And then a couple of recent examples on in the sports industry is like the Dallas Star, so like the Dallas Cowboys. They've built this whole kind of complex, multi mixed use complex in Dallas, and it's like food, nightlife, the game, hotels, all of these things all in one place. And a lot of other sports teams are taking inspiration from them. And I think that's kind of where it's going to go. Like, I think a lot of these sports teams have realized, okay, we have brand equity, but our fan experience isn't great. People, interest is waning. How do we continue to make this a place where people want to go? And they're starting to invest in some of those mixed use facilities. Like, I think the down in Atlanta, they have the same thing. The New Braves Stadium has something to that effect. Another brand that comes to mind from a brand equity perspective, I've mentioned them before, is Ritz-Carlton, right? They're like one of the most widely revered, respected hospitality brands in the world. They've, the original founder and CEO has written books. There's been training of all these other different companies. I think they're one that has, when you think of their brand, everything they do, from the way that the employees interact with customers or guests, to the actual rooms and services that you get there, booking, all of it's all really well thought out and considered. And it builds it's laying those bricks of brand equity where you go to a Ritz-Carlton one time, you're probably going to go back, right?
Yeah, for
They've
sure.
put money in, they've deposited in the trust bank, so to speak, with the customers.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you have a great experience coupled with a really incredible, solid equity to the point, it almost becomes conscious and it becomes synonymous with almost like a luxury brand, and it's really just reaching a point of trust. And it's so concreted into like people's experience that it's just, they'll keep coming back. And then, even going beyond that into word of mouth marketing, right? Where it's just like, if you go out of your way to offer an incredible experience, and even the minor touch points that they might see along their stay of like the equity, maybe it's a logo mark on a towel or soaps, or just seeing you've had such an incredible experience, and everywhere you look, touch, and feel, when you walk out of there, you're telling everybody you come in contact with, anybody that brings up the subject of, going to a certain city that might have a Ritz-Carlton, or even just a night out or a staycation, here in Charlotte, is just like, you have to go and check this place out because it's unreal. Like the amount of attention to detail, all the way to knowing who you are before you walked in because you stayed there before, right? Like, so it's, this link between brand equity and customer experience is so huge, across so many industries, that it really becomes like a subconscious kind of thing, especially you mentioned with sports, and legacy. If you talk to a true fan that has been following a team their whole life, there's chance that they have memorabilia or jerseys spanning through like decades, right? And, if you look at like, there might be slight evolution of logos, or it could just be a deeper equity into the pool of assets that they have. There's things that are always going to be the same, right? Like the Celtics are always going to be Kelly green. The Hornets are always going to be teal and purple, right? The Panthers are always going to have that processed blue, and so the depth of equity like really helps support in a lot of ways the customer experience. And when they go and they're firing on all cylinders in both cases, you have a really charged fan base.
Yeah. I think something that comes to mind in this conversation is, I can hear it now. Somebody who's working in maybe like a more unsexy industry, right? Like home services or manufacturing or something like that, healthcare. Like, yeah, but that's easy when you're a sports team, right? How am I supposed to build brand equity and create a great experience when I'm like a manufacturer dealing with B2B sales, right? And what I've seen in especially the last few years, there's a lot of great ideas from those other industries that are maybe a little bit ahead of the curve from a brand equity and customer experience perspective that those industries can take, and essentially just reuse it in their context. So for example, like you think about like retail is another one, right? Lowe's has become known as a quality brand. You can get, great product experience. They have a solid, throughout all the different touch points, it's Lowe's, right? And you can trust Lowe's. That's in the retail world. You go to the manufacturing world, like, okay, what is it that Lowe's is doing that is building that brand equity? What is it that they're doing that is creating that great customer experience? What are some of the ways you could apply it? So if you're like, I'll make it up. Let's say that you are an HVAC manufacturer. We happen to have one here locally. When you're interacting with B2B customers, right, they're still humans. So they still have the same, human tendencies of like wanting an emotional connection to something, to a brand, or wanting it to be easy to do business with you. So if you say, all right, let's create a dinner where we're going to invite these buyers or these people in, and we're going to take time to get to know them personally. We're going to know who their kids are. We're going to know what their interests are. Maybe we find out that they like a particular bottle of wine. You know what? We're going to mail them that bottle of wine. And now suddenly you've got a lifelong customer who really appreciates, the gesture, and perhaps that bottle of wine is somehow connected back to the brand, right? Like if it's an HVAC manufacturer, maybe it's like there's some kind of interesting, like the brand of the wine is actually connected back to HVAC systems in some way, or maybe it's like in some sort of like really interesting packaging that kind of looks mechanical, right? So you can make these little ties and associations, even if you're in one of these industries that's not in consumer facing brand. It's not, a traditionally, sexy or cool or innovative industry. Like you can still do this. You can still do things that build your brand equity and create those moments that matter with the customer where they, they're like, wow, that was different. Like I just bought, a bunch of HVAC systems for these commercial buildings, and that was like the best thing I've ever done. Like whenever I talk to anybody, I'm gonna be like, have you ever talked to these guys? Like they're fantastic, right? So it doesn't just have to be consumer facing.
Yeah, I think regardless of the industry or, whether it is B2B or B2C or, how sexy your, your industry is, I mean, there's still opportunities to make deep, meaningful connections. There's still opportunities to build loyalty and engagement. Nothing will establish a sense of thoughtfulness and depth and quality like a very sharp brand equity. And then to like, implement that in a way that, doesn't feel overthought or overly cheesy, but, could adorn like small touches that just deliver big meaning, right? When I was working with the Hornets, there was during a playoff stretch, like each of the luxury boxes where they had a lot of the corporate like partners and teams that were coming in, they wanted to like add a layer of celebration. So they put like champagne in all of the quality customer boxes or whatever. And so we did custom champagne labels for them, right? So like, even if they decided that they were going to keep the bottle as a memento or just celebrate it there, it was a small touch point of like, they really thought about everything in this moment of celebration. That is pretty exciting to be in an arena celebrating a playoff run. But, even if it's just a home visit, right, for a company like HVAC, you're working with somebody that's in a home space, then there's small little things that you can do that connect with them in understanding that we're talking about somebody's home. And it's so much more than just like a calendar magnet that we, used to see very widely. It could be something a little bit different that, maybe something that addresses outdoor grilling or the kitchen or like maybe the garage or small tools or something of quality that just, even though we're servicing heating and air, it could go beyond that, right? But then also just, if there's an opportunity in that sales, we pick up that somebody might be into fishing or working on Jeep or something, like listen to them and just kind of like go beyond in that level of like hospitality to deliver. And it's easy to kind of inject brand equity into that, maybe color coded or something of that nature.
Yeah. I remember two specific examples that stories I got to tell. For one, there's this really great clothing brand called Ugmonk. I've been following that for, I don't know, quite a while now, 13, 14 years. And on his 9th anniversary, he did this like special box set that was like this really cool box with like this kind of copper foil on it. And he has this little like copper cut 9. There's like really interesting artwork. He like, this the box, like I have it behind me. Like I kept the box because it was just so cool. Initially I was buying his t-shirts because they were like well designed, well crafted, they fit well, they, all of that. And then it's like every moment, every email, every, anniversary, there was always something that just really put a brick on the brand equity. And like, actually the two posters behind me are from Ugmonk, and so like, those are the kinds of things where you can come up with creative ways. And I mean, shoot, I bought that 9th anniversary pack, but it was because I was such a loyal customer, right?
Yeah.
Like it's weird to buy an anniversary set of something, but not when it looks like art, not when it's it's a unique opportunity to kind of differentiate. And like his positioning is this whole high quality, high crafted, well-designed products. And he does it in everything he does. The other one that comes to mind is I went to an Airbnb in the Netherlands like 5 years ago with my wife, Jordan. And first time in Europe, never been to the Netherlands, never been to Amsterdam. And we had booked this like houseboat thing. And we get there and man, the host, his name is Franz, was like this, him and his wife were the most amazing hosts I've ever had. They had bikes for us. They had a bus pass for us. They had like special coffee, like no extra cost. This was just, they cared deeply about the hospitality and the experience that had all these different, like everything we could possibly think of. They had thought of it before we even got there. And it was so awesome that we've literally been like recently talking about like, man, we got to go back to the Netherlands and hang out with Franz and go, stay on that houseboat again in the canal. Cause it was such a magical experience. And, he didn't have to do that. He didn't have to do all these extra little touches, but it was something that he wanted to do. And you could tell that he was passionate about it, that he cared about it. He cared about making it something that we, would experience and enjoy. And because of that reason, like we're, permanent loyal fans of Franz and the Netherlands.
So how does that relate back to like Airbnb? Did that like deepen your loyalty to the Airbnb because of that experience?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, that was one of the first couple of times we had stayed in Airbnb. And because of that singular experience, I mean, we've booked countless Airbnbs because of that. And yeah, I definitely agree. Like, I think that experience made us more likely, more loyal to Airbnb, more likely to stay there. So, well, I want to wrap us up with some practical tips and tricks. Like, what are some things people who are listening, who are kind of thinking about like, all right, this brand equity thing, I buy it. Like, I think it's important. Like, what are some things that they can do to invest for their brand?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really comes down to like hiring a quality studio or an agency, talking to them, making sure that they like have a good understanding of positioning and how to best serve the needs of the customers, right? Like if you're just painting the walls of the place without considering anything else as far as the atmosphere or the interiors, then like ultimately you're just working twice as hard and maybe creating something that isn't relatable or doesn't set the mood of what, a business might be going for. So in the same way, brand equity is about setting up a slam dunk for customer experience, right? And it should go hand in hand. And then, in order to do so, you kind of have to understand what that North Star is. Like, what are some of your focus, who's your core customers? Like, who are you trying to relate to? And what are some of the values that you're trying to deliver? It could be the difference of meaningless equity to something that just resonates and even brings your brand further downstream beyond like what you ever thought was possible, right? And it comes from just uncovering a lot more of who you are as a brand and, you know, giving depth. You mentioned sports being an incredible example of brand equity, and it's true. I mean, if you look at any standard professional sports team, they have primary logos, they have word marks, they have logo types, they have secondary logos, they have partial logos, they have patterns, colors, celebrations. Like, each system could have like 20 different marks, icon systems. Giving depth to what you do really is a support of the position and who you are, and like looking for stories, looking to tell deeper, richer stories of what you're doing. It really comes down to just having the right studio or agency that understands like how to guide a brand into finding this deeper quality brand equity, tell better stories, as well as consider the importance of customer experience along that.
Good stuff, man. This was a great conversation. I want to give people the opportunity to look you up online. Where can folks find you?
Yeah, find us online at jtcmstudio.com or both on Instagram and Facebook of the same at JTCM Studio. It's really easy.
And folks, you can find me online, drewburdick.com. Also, pretty much every social network, Drew H. Burdick. Joel, thanks so much for being on the show, and super appreciate you sharing your insights and your stories.
Awesome. Drew, thank you so much for having me, buddy.
All right, talk soon. Hey there. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you could take a second, hit the subscribe button below. It would really mean the world. I'm trying to make some great content for you every week by interviewing folks and hearing what they have to say about building great experiences. I try to share tips and tricks and things like that. Anyways, take a second, hit that like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Thanks, guys.